Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video I wanted to have a discussion about build viability and why this league start of all league starts, the big meta shakeup, didn't see too much of a shake at all, and we saw a lot of players return to the tried and true, and most players kind of sitting on similar builds throughout the league now that we're even a month in. It just seems like we're getting a lot of the old favorites with a few new ones sprinkled in, and I'm going to address why I think this is the case from a kind of very objective standpoint, and then hopefully if we get a good discussion out of this, we can then pass that feedback on to GGG if we can all decide that that's the case. So let's get into it. So there's definitely a ton of different things to consider here when talking about builds. Builds are some of the most complicated things in any game that I've ever played, and constructing a good one is incredibly difficult. So there's definitely a massive barrier to entry on incredible amounts of levels, you know, the main one being knowledge and all sorts of stuff like that. So the first thing we need to consider is that most players aren't going to be making their own builds. I would probably wager that, you know, somewhere between 90 to 95% of players play something they're used to or pick up a build from someone who's made one online and kind of copy that and, you know, go for that instead. And the players who don't do so probably aren't able to make it through the game at a reasonable rate, and they probably aren't going to be defeating stuff like Maven or Uber Elder or Sirius and all sorts of stuff like that. So that's kind of the first thing to consider. There is a massive barrier to entry in creating new builds, and that's only going to be harder the more restrictive the rule set that we have to make builds is. And we'll get to why this is actually the case in a little bit here. So most builds are comprised of three primary areas. They're comprised of defense, you know, that's stuff like resistances, ailment immunity, mitigation, and sustain. They're comprised of damage and scaling damage through different means, as well as clear and utility, which is stuff like, you know, AoE, movement speed, and stuff like that. Those are the three primary elements to consider when you're making a build. And making sure you scale each of them in a way that makes it so that it's suitable for your playstyle is incredibly important. So no build is going to have the same amount of any of these unless it's an identical build. So for example, a mapping character that I'm playing right now, a Tornado Shot Deadeye, prioritizes heavily going for clear and utility over everything else. It sacrifices a ton of defense, it sacrifices a ton of damage, all to get clear and utility. So my priority of this build was to hit the whole screen. I don't care if I can do Cirrus, I don't care if I can do Shaper, and that's kind of what makes this build cool. Now, another build, for example, a deep delve build, you know, which wants to go to insane depths, where the monsters have millions and millions and millions of HP, you know, that build wants to prioritize damage. They don't care so much about defense because anything at that level is going to one-shot them anyway, overall. And then, you know, hardcore builds want to prioritize defense because they can't afford to die, because they'll lose everything, including the character itself. So your playstyle really is going to dictate which one of these you want to invest in. But in general, most effective characters and the best characters find a balance between some of these. And generally, they have a bit more of one, depending on the content they're doing. But they have a reasonable balance of all of these things. The most powerful characters, like in Ritual and all sorts of stuff like that, did indeed kind of invest in all of these in reasonably equal amounts, and that's why they felt so good to play. You had access to all different parts of creating a character. And I think the biggest issue with build viability and diversity right now is that it's not actually entirely possible to do this on a wide array of skills. We're going to dig into why that might be in a little bit here, but that's the kind of overarching point that I want to highlight here, and we're going to explain why that is. All right, so the case that I want to present to you now is League Start. So League Start builds generally want to be bossing based builds. They're builds that need to rely on skill tree and skill gems to scale, as gear is not openly and widely available due to the fact that, you know, not many people have crafting materials, items in general, and everyone's just starting out. An additional pressure on League Start builds is that they need to be able to, most cases, clear most of the content in the game. With the way the game is structured right now, overall, Most players want their build to be able to do, you know, the white maps, the yellow maps, the red maps, all the conquerors in between, and then Cirrus, and even some of the invitations and Maven and stuff like that. So that they can unlock all of their, you know, their Uncharted Realms passives, they can unlock the Atlas, and all sorts of stuff like that, and kind of really leverage a league start scenario to their advantage to kind of get set up in the game. So most builds are going to be boss killers to start out with, and that is definitely not a easy bar to kind of reach, and the floor is already set very, very high. So for the most part, you need anywhere between 2 to 4 million DPS to clear the entire game comfortably, and that's with 100% uptime. So uptime's a topic I want to touch on here. So uptime essentially is the concept of dealing your DPS to the boss 100% of the time. So, you know, if a boss has 70 million HP and you do 2 million DPS with 100% uptime, you know, that's going to take 35 seconds to kind of kill the boss, which is a reasonable amount, and you know, that's kind of what you're shooting for there. You obviously don't need that amount of damage on a boss with that much HP, but in a scenario with Shaper, you know, he heals a bunch, he has a bunch of immunity phases, he does a bunch of mechanics, which can be quite dangerous, and most bosses, you know, that's kind of the amount which you'd want for it to feel good and have the character feel effective. So yeah, it's definitely a very, very high bar here for damage. And already to reach that amount of damage without investing in a significant amount of gear as a kind of scaling factor here, that's going to be incredibly difficult. So the first limiting factor on build diversity and viability is damage and how it can scale without gear. Primarily, most league starters try and focus on skill gem scaled kind of builds. So you've got stuff like Toxic Rain, Caustic Arrow, Minions, Totems. That's why Forbidden Rite is so popular, because it scales off of the totem's life, which is directly impacted by the level of the spell totem gem. So overall, damage is a massive restricting factor on how many builds are viable in the game, especially in a league start scenario, and I feel like that's primarily what most people are interested in having be diverse. A lot of players only play one character, 2 characters, or something like that, and if your first character always needs to be somebody that can do all the content in the game and, you know, beat all the bosses, then it's probably going to be one of these damage over time scaling builds that, you know, leverages gem levels as well as some skill tree multipliers, because that's the easiest stuff you have access to and you don't have a whole lot of gear. Now, let's talk a little bit more about uptime though, because I think this is an incredibly important topic to discuss. So we've obviously got on the one side of things, we've got stuff like damage over time, totems, minions. These generally have pretty close to 100% uptime because, you know, you've got your minions, they're attacking, they're doing their own thing, and you can dodge all the boss abilities in the meantime, and your minions will continue to attack. Similarly with dots, you know, you can dot the boss up and it'll be ticking on the boss while you're running around doing your own thing, dodging the boss abilities. You know, a good example of this is like Veritania. You can DPS her while she's using the Ice Spear attack on you just fine as a minion build, and that's going to be an incredible advantage over a build that cannot do so. So if you take a Bone Shatter Juggernaut, for example, that does 2 million DPS, and you take a minion build that does 2 million DPS, well, I would wager that the Bone Shatter Juggernaut, even though he does the same amount of DPS as the minion build, he's probably going to have something like, you know, 20 to 25% of the damage overall on bosses as the minion build, just purely from the fact that A, you're melee and the bosses move around, and B, you need to dodge attacks, which means you're not attacking the boss at the same time. This is inherently completely unbalanced and makes it incredibly difficult for any character that doesn't have inbuilt uptime mechanics to do well in a bossing scenario, and the entire early game of Path of Exile in a league start scenario is built around bosses. Essentially shoehorning everyone into playing those builds overall, which, you know, is a little bit of a shame. So that's point number one. Obviously, you have builds in there like ranged builds, which, you know, kind of have a middle ground here. But the exception to this rule is builds that can completely burst bosses and one-phase them, essentially mitigating all of their mechanics and making sure that they don't do anything. So this is the other popular league start that we've seen in past leagues and people keep defaulting back to. That's stuff like mines as well as traps. You can put down, you know, like 20 mines or whatever it is, or a ton of traps, and then the boss spawns spawns and he goes boom when he loses all his HP, and then he goes to the next phase without doing any mechanics. And in that scenario, you essentially have 100% uptime as well, because, you know, the boss gets insta-phased and goes straight into the immunity phase once again. So these are the kind of strategies that a lot of players employ, and until this systemic issue with the game is addressed, and, you know, whether or not, you know, the 100% uptime build gets some sort of nerf to be brought in line with attack-based builds or active builds or anything like that, I don't think that we're going to see any sort of diversity whatsoever at all in a league start scenario to come, because due to the fact that, you know, uptime is so important and the entire game is balanced around boss killing right now. So ways that this could change is, you know, the entire atlas is not balanced around boss killing. That would kind of introduce swap up opportunity for example, people league starting mappers instead of league starting boss killers. You know, we could also see those nerfs to those builds. You know, overall, I don't think it's something that is going to change without extreme focus on making that happen. All right. Next one I want to talk about here is defenses. So overall, actually, we're going to address this over here first. So primarily, there's 3 different ways that you can scale your character, and we alluded to them a little bit earlier on. So the first one here is the skill tree. So the skill tree is available to most characters. It's an equal and even playing field for the most part, with, you know, the beginning characters, you know, around 85 to 90, having a similar amount of points to spend on the skill tree as players who are level 100, who have invested, you know, hundreds and hundreds of hours in their character. This, in my opinion, is a good way to kind of differentiate between a lower character and a higher character. You just, you know, 10 points on the skill tree is probably around 50 to 100% more damage at the very, very, very high end with stuff like cluster jewels and stuff like that. So overall, I think this is an acceptable amount to kind of push your character further, and it's in a pretty good place, and you can kind of access a lot of the power which is available to you in the game very, very easily and very, very early, which is good. It lets you build and have a lot of freedom with your character. Overall, you have stuff like ascendancy points, which is incredibly powerful as well. And in general, you're going to be getting a lot of your defense, a lot of your damage, and a lot of your a little bit of your clear and utility from that trait, which is historically how it's always been. The next one I want to talk about here is skill gems. So skill gems, of course, are an important one as well. You know, you got stuff like supports, and they're essentially going to be supporting you for defense, damage, and clear and utility as well. But I want to talk a little bit about skill gems in a second here. But the next one I want to talk about here is gear. So skill gems in general, you know, they can scale up to like skill gem level 20, you know, sometimes in some cases 21, and you have stuff like awakened gems, but they really don't scale much past that. Again, it's kind of on par with a skill tree. You can get, you know, like 50 to 100% more damage kind of tops from upgrading your skill gems through the skill gem system. Overall, it's not going to make a massive difference in the power scale of things, and I think it's a reasonable place with, you know, where it's at balance wise from like kind of a newer player to a really end-to-end game player. So yeah, that's fine. Now, let's come to gear though. So gear is the odd one out. So with gear, you can kind of take your defense, your damage, and your clear and utility to absolutely ludicrous levels. A difference between a character that is just starting out and a character that is super duper geared is, you know, sometimes, you know, like 100 times the damage. It's absolutely ridiculous, and it does in most cases scale exponentially. You know, if you've got like a 4 mod weapon versus a 5 mod weapon versus a 6 mod weapon with all the mods being perfect, it's a completely different world. And overall, gear, in my opinion, is the primary culprit for the out of whack balancing that we see in the game. And overall, why a lot of players hit brick walls and cannot progress with their character. It is kind of the odd one out here, but we're going to continue to talk a little bit about that after we talk about the nerfs. So overall, you know, the game was in a reasonable place. You could kind of pick and choose which skill you wanted to pick in 3.14 and 3.13 and have a reasonable shot at beating a ton of the end game bosses. And the reason for that is that the bosses and the game in general seem to be balanced damage-wise around having enough damage from skill tree as well as skill gems and support gems. You kind of reach the requisite amount off of just these two things alone in a lot of cases. And you didn't need to invest too heavily into the gear side of things in order to do bosses like Cirrus and Elder and all sorts of stuff like that. And that worked quite well with the kind of end game that we had set up right now. So new players could come in, they could invest time into their character by leveling up their character, by leveling up their skill gems, and they could progress through through the game at a reasonable rate without having to kind of delve too much into the currency side of things and the farming side of things and the economy and crafting side of things, which essentially made it a reasonably smooth game to play, and you could consistently make progress on your character from play session to play session. Now, enter 3.15. In which they introduced a number of new requirements for builds, as well as reducing the amount of options available to us. So the first thing I want to talk about here is skill gems. So as we discussed earlier, damage is a big deal. It's very, very important to have high damage so that you can kind of do a lot of the end game bosses. And in 3.15, they nerfed one of the consistent ways to do this in skill gems. You can no longer, for example, kind of like steamroll a lot of the early content due to the more multiplier nerfs on a lot of the skill gems. Overall, you lost about 50 to 40% damage, and in some cases, on the lower end of things, that is the difference between your build being viable or not viable in some endgame scenarios. So that already put a massive restrictive layer on a lot of the different skills and ideas and the builds that you could do in the end game, and definitely further funneled you to builds with high uptime and also with gem level scaling, which was not entirely reliant on support gems. So that's kind of point number one. In addition to that though, when you take something away from one area, it puts more pressure on the other areas. So in order to make up the damage that you lost from skill gems, you need to then recoup that damage in other areas. So for example, in the skill tree area or the gear area. So in the skill tree area, this means that you essentially have to sacrifice either defense or utility and clear, or you need to find that somewhere else. A lot of players probably decided to drop defense to pick up more damage, just get a few more damage nodes to kind of mitigate the nerfs. That's fine, but it does have to come from somewhere, and you did see a lot of the pull coming away from that. So in most cases this would be fine, but overall it did push a lot more players into requiring more and more gear, which is something that they were not used to in previous leagues. All right, let's move on to the real problem here though. So the real problem is that they not only nerfed support gems, but they also nerfed clear and utility in the form of flasks, as well as movement speed, but they also, in addition to that, nerfed damage through flasks as well as defense through flasks. So we got a triple whammy on the hit of the options and the toolkit to characters, and then again, that needs to be recouped some way, shape, or form through additional mods on gear or skill tree. It can't be recouped through skill gems because they, aren't scalable too much, but overall, that was a big hit. But in addition to that, they didn't just nerf the flasks, they also introduced a new requirement for characters in the form of improved ailment scaling. So, stuff like bleeds, ignites, they hit harder and they're more important. And they also removed the option to have ailment immunity through flasks as well. So now characters also need to pick up ailment immunity, either on their ascendancy and skill tree, which is more pressure on the skill tree, or on their gear as well. So basically the combination of all these things, nerfing damage from skill gems, pushing more onus onto other areas like skill tree and gear, nerfing flasks, again, pushing more pressure on a gear and skill tree, and then also introducing new requirements that require you to have additional kind of scaling mods on your gear and skill tree for ailments. This is basically the perfect storm for meaning that it's incredibly difficult to create a character that is not the best of the best. It kind of funnels everyone into the perfect skill gems, which scale the best and which scale the easiest and require the least amount of investment on these two areas as possible. And that's why you see stuff like Necromancer being highly represented. It doesn't really need any offensive mods on gear. It doesn't really need too much investment on the skill tree, meaning you can just fully invest into stuff like defense and damage. It didn't rely on flasks for damage, so it didn't get hit by that. You even had stuff like the mana nerfs, meaning some builds need to now invest their gear and skill tree into mana as well, which overall, it just is like this massive perfect storm, a conglomerate of nerfs, which overall did really, really impact the meta, not in a positive way, but in a negative way. It's distracted from variety of the builds that you can play and the viability of builds, and it's reinforced the meta which stood by in previous leagues, which was the dot meta. So overall, definitely a little bit unfortunate. So summing it up here, guys, the reason we're seeing such low viability on a lot of builds and such low diversity in league starters and the start of the league and even sometimes in the later ends of the league is due to the fact that we've got enormous pressure on the game systems which we have open to us to build our characters. If you want a character that feels good in all areas of those, you need to invest in heavy amounts of gear. All the pressure has been put onto the gear or getting high levels on the skill tree. There's definitely not really anywhere to go. Not really any wiggle room in getting a lot of these things that we didn't have before, and then also getting the things that we had before back. So it definitely is quite difficult, and that is why you're seeing a lot of players, kind of tap out early, feel like it's a little bit unfair, and overall you're seeing a lot of people return to the tried and true and the most powerful skills overall. So that's kind of going to be my TED Talk on builds and viability. I do want to talk a little bit about how this might end up being solved in the future and the questions I might ask Chris Wilson in my upcoming interview about how this might be solved. So right now, I think that one of the biggest issues about why people hit these stone walls is that, they get to the point in which they've gotten before with their skill tree and skill gems, and then they now have to invest in gear, but the actual crafting system and the way in which you acquire gear is incredibly difficult. It's very, very complex, it's very, very expensive in a lot of cases to get good items, and overall, most players feel like they just hit a brick wall in which they have to buy an item for 50 exalts. And that's definitely not where you want to put your players, in my opinion. So I think that making the crafting system more accessible, more rewarding, and more online early, and more accessible for things like ailment immunity and stuff like that is definitely going to go a long way. And the other thing that I'd like to ask, if there's any plans to make it so that bosses aren't the primary focus of Path of Exile, especially in the league start scenario. In previous leagues, stuff like Uber Elder and Shaper were push content. You didn't have to do it, it was an option, but now it feels like bossing, especially at the league start, is mandatory. And that shoehorns people into playing very, very powerful bossing characters at league start. So hope you guys have enjoyed my video here. Please let me know if you guys have any opinions on this. I really, really want to hear everyone's feedback on this topic specifically because it really does seem like a big sticking point when I talk to other creators and gather questions from the community. Does this address pretty much what the issues are for build diversity and viability? What do you guys think? Let me know down below. And until then, cheers.